photographer, documentary photographer as well, and filmmaker. And this channel is all about encouraging you to tell your story with a camera and have fun while doing it. And this live stream I do every Friday night, and it's all about taking your questions, a little Q&A on photography, and whatever comes up is what we discuss. Tonight, what I want to start off with is a question that I've been getting a lot. I think it is natural at this time of the year because a lot of people are getting cameras and starting to explore photography for the first time. And so the question that I've been getting a lot recently has been first-time camera buyers who are looking to get into the Fuji system, who are interested to know what would be the best Fuji camera to start out with. Specifically, I've been getting a lot of questions about the X100F, which I have shot a lot with, and I did some videos with that, as well as the XE3, which I am currently using right now. And I want to break down some ideas for you guys about this topic, not just in terms of like really technically reviewing the cameras, because I've done some of that and there are other channels that do that really well, but more so to kind of discuss some of the ideas about the best cameras that make sense to get started with in the Fuji system. And first of all, just to say that I think that Fuji is a really good camera system to start off with if you are just starting off in photography. And after I kind of break this down a little bit, we'll jump into the questions here in the chat as folks come in, and I'll kind of interact a little bit more and just take more questions from you guys at that point. But to start off, I want to dig into this question a little bit about first cameras, and specifically X100 series versus interchangeable lens cameras in the Fuji system. I think that Fuji is a great system regardless. So to start off with, understand that whether you get the X100F, X100T, or even the S, versus any of the interchangeable lens systems, the Fuji lineup as a whole is really simple to use and it's very straightforward. It accentuates the items that you need the most in photography, the things and the features that you use, which is pretty much your ISO, your shutter speed, your aperture, the exposure triangle, if you will. And those things are very prominent, very obvious, and they are tactile. So you have the ability to control your aperture on the lens, which is, of course, I'm not going to do a whole tutorial on beginner photography stuff in this video, but being able to control the aperture directly on the lens without having to go into any menus is awesome. And in a lot of ways, it's very like analog photography, very simple, very retro. And of course, the cameras do have that look, which everyone likes that aesthetic, or I feel like a lot of people who like that aesthetic and can't afford Leica, or who just like Fuji better, even if they can afford Leica. Personally, at this point I can't afford Leica, although if you add up all the Fuji cameras that I've bought over the last couple of years, it probably would translate to one Leica, and I'm happy with Fuji. But all that to say, you have the aperture control on the outside, you have a wheel that controls the shutter speed, and some of the Fuji cameras even have a separate ISO wheel, and that really puts the exposure triangle right at your fingertips, all of the things that you need to do the most basic control of your imagery, and that really separates, iPhone photography from manual photography, where you're really creating different effects and changing the way that your image looks through your camera settings and taking advantage of a quote unquote real camera. And the way that Fuji makes those things really external, very simple to use, and very tactile, I think makes Fuji one of the things that makes Fuji superior, I believe, for starting out. Now, I didn't start out on a Fuji camera. I started out on a Nikon DSLR, and I've shot with Nikon, a tiny bit with Canon, a little bit with Sony, and also Panasonic as well, which is what I use for my video stuff, and then of course iPhone for my live streams. And the bottom line is all these cameras are really good, but I think that one of the big advantages that Fuji has over the other systems is that the ease of use and the way that the cameras handle it really changes the way that you interact with your environment when you have fewer things to think about or wonder about, and it's like it's much simpler. It's just the layout is better, in my opinion. And that counts for a whole bunch. Like, that counts for a lot that technical specifications are not going to tell you. So, people talk about how, like, the Sony cameras, like the RX100 Mark V, it shoots 24 frames per second. And, these little Fuji cameras maybe don't shoot quite so fast. And honestly, I could not possibly care less. And for most people, I don't think those technical specifications are going to matter. But when you're first looking at a camera, a lot of times the technical specifications are the things that you're looking at most prominently, because that's what you can get the most information about when you're on the internet. And it's been kind of funny. I've gotten this question a lot over the last couple of weeks. People have watched my X100F video and been, just getting into photography, and they want to know about it. And Martin, if you are watching this, another Martin, not the Martin from Canada that I made the video about, and also I believe Amber and a couple other folks, that they asked me this question just very recently, so I figured I'd go to town on it. So, first of all, the difference between the interchangeable lens versus the fixed lens, honestly, and this may not be a very popular opinion, and you guys may feel free to agree or disagree as you see fit, and you can drop all that down in the comments. But I believe that if you're just learning about photography, less is more. And so I think, honestly, that the fixed lens of the X100 series is really a selling point, because it is very, very simple. It's small, it's light, and you know what you're going to get every time you look through there. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of people like the X100 system, because people go into it using it with the idea that they're going to use it as a B cam or something that's just going to be a carry around casual camera. And then the way that it winds up working out is it becomes it becomes a more useful camera, because the fact that you have less to think about every time that you take it out. It's just, let me figure out how I'm going to compose my shot, instead of second guessing myself about different lenses that I need to use or whatever. Now, I'm not saying that the X100 series are objectively superior to any of the other cameras, and I am going to talk a little bit about some vague comparisons between the X100F versus, and the X100 series really is what this is about. X100 series versus interchangeable lens series, to kind of compare those, because I don't think that the direct comparison between these specific cameras, that they're very similar in a lot of ways. So it's really hard to compare these cameras directly, but it's a lot easier to make a general comparison, say fixed lens versus interchangeable. And there's a couple of features I'll point out that I think are significant. But I think that the fixed lens actually is really advantageous, because the X100 series, you can shoot pretty much anything. If you want to do portrait work, you can even get the teleconverter to screw on there, so you get a 50mm equivalent, which is the regular size lens. You can get close with the X100F if you're not shooting, and X100 series if you're not shooting wide open. They are really fantastic cameras for environmental portraiture, street photography, landscape photography even. There may be times when you want something a little bit tighter for portrait, and you might want something a little bit wider for landscape, but at least with landscape stuff, you can typically, you can stitch images together in post if you're really intent on doing that. Or, and for portrait stuff, like you can get pretty darn close with the X100 cameras, and having that fixed lens is fairly advantageous. Now, that doesn't mean it's the best thing for everybody at every point in their photographic journey. I think that, I've gone through phases where the X100 series has been the right answer for me, and I've used that and really loved it. I think that the fixed lens, though, is really particularly useful for beginners when you're just starting out, because it eliminates a huge amount of decisions that you're not really equipped to make. So when you're first starting out in photography, and even if you've had some experience but you're really getting into it more seriously, the question of, should I get a 23mm lens or a 50 equivalent, or a 50mm portrait, the 85mm equivalent portrait lens, tele versus wide, like, these are questions that you really have to shoot for a while and get to the point where you can say, okay, I would have really liked to have this, or I would liked it better if this were different. And then you have the ability to say upgrade your equipment rather than speculating on what you think you're going to want to shoot or the way that you're going to want to shoot. Because at the end of the day, you can shoot anything with anything for the most part. The question is, are you going to be willing and interested to put in the time to to adapt the equipment that you have to a variety of different situations, assuming that you're not just made out of money, you're not a Bitcoin millionaire, and you're going to go out and spend just buy one of everything. So having those limitations, I think, makes the X100 series really, really useful when you're starting out, even though it seems like the opposite would be true. It's a great place to start out. Now, the X100F specifically, I have shot with that camera a bunch. I've shot with the X100T a bunch, and to people who are, kind of teetering, but they're on the fence and they like the idea of the X100 cameras because they do give you beautiful image quality. But they're concerned about, like, well, if I don't have the ability to change lenses, is that going to be a problem? Honestly, what I would say, if you're just starting out and you're drawn to the X100 series, I would say to go with the T or even the S and save money. Because what is inevitably going to happen when you first start shooting is you're probably going to want to dabble with a few different cameras. And if you buy an X100F, you're going to be buying it new, it's going to depreciate pretty rapidly, the value is going to decrease, and then your ability to resell it is going to be negatively impacted when invariably, not because there's anything wrong with the camera, but because, hey, like, we like to buy stuff. We have gas, we have gear acquisition syndrome. That's part of the deal. I don't think there are too many people that get into photography who don't like cameras for their own sake. I know, at least for myself, like, I enjoy buying cameras. That's why I talk about cameras. And to me, photography has a lot to do with cameras as much as it does with pictures and experiences. And I think that being prepared for that reality, that inevitability, I think that's a good thing. And so I feel like for a first camera, instead of overbuying, which is what people tend to want to do, I gotten some questions about like XT2 versus X100F. My suggestion is X100T. Less is more, because you're going to be able to learn a lot more when you're having to adapt and you have less distractions. And when you're buying a little bit lower down on the food chain, you're going to have the ability to save money, which is going to be important because inevitably you're going to want different things in the next iteration of the cameras that you get, but you're going to be buying that later when you have better information about what you actually need and where your limitations and boundaries truly are, rather than what you think you want to shoot and what you might encounter. You can't really make all those decisions up front. So to me, the X100T really is a better value because you can save a whole bunch of money, and the resale value is going to be there if you buy it used already. Um, you know, it's not like, it's like when you drive a new car off the lot, it depreciates a lot. And so the same idea, I guess, goes with cameras. And the other thing too is whatever you get to start out with, make sure that you're not that you're babying it, that you treat it really, really well, because you might find out that, something didn't add up, or you decide that you want something else, or what have you. So that would be my recommendation in most cases, is really to steer folks who are just starting out towards the X100 series. And that is my perspective. I don't think that necessarily is an objective truth. There are some people who just automatically know that they really want to have the flexibility of changing lenses right out front. And that's kind of the position that I'm in right now. I've gone back and forth, but one of the reasons why I advocate for buying a lesser than newest iteration model, buying the X100T instead of the F, is because of the fact that I have gotten, I've gone from that being in that position where I said, okay, X100F is going to be it for me. I don't need to change lenses. In fact, I don't want to ever change lenses again. And then, after a little while, I kind of got curious about the XE3. And so I went with that and wound up actually selling my X100F. Again, not because it's a bad camera, but because, like, the position I'm in right now, I can only afford one camera. And, I'm glad that I had it. I got a lot of great use out of it. It's a camera that I want to own again at some point, but right now I'm kind of skipping around a little bit. So for folks that are looking at the X100 series, I guess my overall point with those specific cameras is don't be intimidated or don't be intimidated or dissuaded by the fact that you can't change the lenses. I think that's a good thing. They're excellent cameras. They take excellent pictures, and that limitation is actually a really good thing. On the other hand, folks who just automatically know that they don't want that limitation, want to start out with something a little bit different. I've been asked. Michael Power asked me if I would compare the X100F with the XT20. After I haven't shot the XT20, I've shot the XT10. I shot the XT2, I've shot the X100F, and now most recently I've been shooting the XE3. And the XE3, the XT2, and the X100F have fairly similar innards. So the comparison that I'm going to give you is based on that and also reading some of the features of the XT20. Really what a lot of this stuff comes down to in terms of technical specifications. The XE3 has the touch screen, and it doesn't have the articulating screen in the back that can give you a different perspective. Some people really like that. There are definitely times when it is very handy. I don't think that it's a complete gimmick, but at the same time I also it's something that I can live without, and I've been really, really happy with the performance of the XE3. And the XE3, XT20, I think they are very comparable. I think the XE3 may have a little bit faster autofocus. I believe the XT20 is probably a little bit faster in terms of autofocus than the X100F, but one of the reasons why it's so hard to compare these cameras is because ultimately, if you know how to take the type of pictures that you want to take, that's what's going to be the deciding factor. I could make great pictures, or what I consider to be great pictures, with any one of these cameras without being significantly limited by any feature or lack of feature, or options or lack of options. I felt like the one video that I did with the X100F, that climbing video, where I went out with the X100F for a day in the mountains in British Columbia, or Alberta, technically, in Banff National Park with my friend Martin. We climbed a huge mountain together, and I shot the whole day just using stills. And I didn't feel like there were any major limitations that I couldn't overcome, despite using a camera that I've never used in exactly that context before, and a camera that is not engineered or designed with that in mind. There are always going to be technical features one way or the other that you could use, but at the end of the day, and this may not be super helpful, because I can't say, oh, steer away from this and steer towards that. It's just that at the end of the day, these cameras all have very, very, very similar image quality. And yes, there are, pixel peeping and stuff that you could do to differentiate by a very, very small margin. The X100T versus the F, yeah, there's a little bit less room for cropping. Yeah, you're going to probably print a little smaller, but I mean, I got like 16 or like 20 by 30 size prints done from the X100T that look beautiful. No problem there whatsoever. So I don't think that a lot of that comparison, or the hairs that people want to split to say that this camera is better than that camera, unfortunately, I don't think it's that clear, which really is, in a lot of ways, that's a good thing, because that means you have to choose between a good camera. Which one of the good cameras do you want? Not necessarily a better or worse. You got to figure out what is going to be most economical for you, and which is going to inspire you the most to take that camera and go out and really learn its curves and learn how to use it. So comparing out of all of these cameras, in a lot of ways, I think that if you want interchangeable, I think that the XE3 for the money. The body is like $900 last time I checked. You can get it with the 23mm lens for 1150, somewhere in that neighborhood, and the XE3 is faster than the X100F, and both in acquiring autofocus and then like tracking autofocus is very good. The performance is as good, if not better in some cases, than the XT2 when I last shot it. So it's going to give you a little higher performance than the X100F. But if you're attracted to the X100 series, and as I told Martin, who I spoke with just this week, just messaged me on Instagram, asked me if I'd be willing to chat with them on the phone, or I'm happy to talk shop with folks about cameras. If you're looking in the X100 series, don't be intimidated by that. And I would say look at the T instead of the F, because especially if you're starting out, the F is kind of pricey. If you buy the T, you can always use it for a year, resell it for almost the same amount of money. You're not going to be limited by the features. There's not that much that you get from the T to the F that makes it worth the extra $500 when you could save that money, resell it a year later for something else if you want to, or even keep it and then have enough in your budget to buy an additional camera, and that maybe gives you interchangeable lenses. Or if you want to get interchangeable lenses from the start, the XT20 or the XT3 are both really, really good. And when it comes down to image quality, the determining factor about image quality with these cameras, because the sensors are all good and the images are almost identical, if you give it the right light and the right circumstances, are going to take basically the same quality of images. The thing that's going to make the difference is the person behind the camera and how much you care about putting in the time to use the camera in a way that you're going to actually master it and you're going to get better at using it. Um, so there's that, and that's kind of, I don't know if that is helpful at all for anybody who is kind of looking at buying these cameras. What I would want to do really more than anything with all of this discussion is to try to put your mind at ease and say, look, it doesn't matter in a lot of ways which one of these that you get. No matter which one you get, you're going to want something else in 6 months time anyways, probably, because cameras are fun and these are good cameras and you're going to be curious about what you can do with them. So get one, enjoy it, but make a decision that's going to be economical for you. And in a lot of ways, um, I feel like in a lot of ways I've been a little bit harsh with the X100F just because of the fact that I don't feel like it offers a huge amount of substantial improvement over the T. Uh, it is still a beautiful camera. It takes great pictures. And if you have it in your budget for the F and you like that series and you want to go that way, it is a really, really fantastic camera. But ultimately, somebody who is able to take good pictures with the T, you're not going to see a world of improvement when they go to the F. It's not like, oh wow, what happened? Is that a new camera? I've done videos where I've shown photos that I've taken with the T and with the F and kind of put them all like side by side and said, okay, pick the one. I think in my X100F video, like pick the one that was taken with the F over the T, and to my eye, I don't think that you can actually do that and say, oh, this is obviously the T, this is obviously the F. They're both a little bit slower than the interchangeable lens models, or at least the XE3 and the XT2, are on the faster side in terms of what you're getting with the autofocus. But again, with practice and with use, whatever a camera lacks in terms of autofocus, you're going to be able to make up through skill and composition. And that's something, unless you're shooting highly specialized stuff, and in the event that you're shooting highly specialized stuff, you're already a professional and you're not watching this video to ask yourself what kind of camera that you should get. So to my mind, the XE3, though, I have been very, 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 very happy with that. And I did personally because, and again, I'm not just starting out, I have shot the X100T for almost a year, maybe even more than a year, exclusively before I ventured into the XT10, which was my first interchangeable Fuji system. And so I think there's a lot to be said for doing a fixed lens camera in the Fuji system if you're just starting out, just to kind of get up to speed. And then when you get curious about the different lenses and you've really mastered the use of the camera and the composition, you kind of go to that interchangeable system. But then you find yourself thinking, man, I just missed the simplicity of the X100 series. So if you start off buying the T, there's a better chance you'll be able to afford to keep that and get an interchangeable system alongside that instead of sacrificing, which, that's kind of the mistake that I made with the X100F, is that I had to swap that because of the financial position that I'm in. I had to swap the F for the XE3 and I couldn't keep them both. And I really like the F, but if I had just stuck with the X100T, I probably would have been able to squeak by and justify having both. But at the same time, right now, I'm with the XE3, and I think the touchscreen on the XE3, the image quality, the speed, performance, the battery life in the cold, the way the touchscreen responds in the cold, all of that stuff. The sensor is fantastic. I would probably recommend to somebody who really wants to get the newer sensor, the X-Trans 3 sensor. My pathway into that would go through the XE3 at this point because it's really economical and it's got, all the goods on it, and it's small and it's fun, and it's the kind of camera that doesn't have extra features in it that you don't really need. And one of the things that I have tried to do in my videos, to some detriment, not everybody appreciates it, but I try to reinforce the idea that when you are buying a camera, that most of the time a more expensive camera is not going to necessarily take better pictures. The only difference is that if you spend more on a newer camera, in most cases you're going to be more excited about that camera, you're going to use it more, you're going to feel obligated to get your money's worth out of it, and then that is going to push you to take advantage of this camera. Whereas if you then, after kind of improving your game a little bit, then go back to an older camera, you then find that, oh hey, I can make images on this older camera that look as good as the one that I made on the newer camera. Maybe the secret really did not lie in the technology of the newer camera, but rather that lies in the way that I view the camera and am inspired to go out and shoot more with it. So don't discount stuff like the X Pro 1 and the XT1. Specifically, I would say even the XT1. Like the X Pro 1, I had that, I sold it. The X Pro 1 was nice, but I did miss the fact that I didn't have Wi-Fi on that, whereas I believe the XT1 has weather sealing and it has Wi-Fi. And again, you can pick that up for around $700-800 on eBay, which is, to get into the system, like kind of really, I think the comparison should be XT1 versus X100T if you're just getting into this, rather than trying to buy in on the higher end models right now, because those cameras have features and have benefits that you're not going to fully be able to take advantage of as you're learning, and then you wind up just paying for stuff that may not be super advantageous to you in your position, and then you want to change cameras anyways in a year just because you get curious about the rest of the Fuji lineup and the rest of the Fuji lenses and what have you. So that's my perspective, my opinion. Your mileage may vary. Would love to hear from you guys. Anybody here? I see we got some folks in the chat, and I'm open, ready to take questions. If anybody has questions, chat a little bit. I wanted to get that opening monologue out of the way, and I hope that's helpful to some of you guys who are looking at buying cameras for the first time. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it because I think a lot of what I have seen out here kind of revolves around the idea that there's a need to buy better cameras, and I don't really think that there is a need for better cameras. I think a lot of it is just the way that we see the camera and the way that we view our relationship with what we're shooting based on the camera. And I don't see too many ways that a person shooting stills could have a Fuji camera and be really disappointed or unhappy with it. I mean, I've seen some people complain about the Fuji cameras on Reddit or certain lenses. I mean, even with the lenses, I've been shooting the XE3 with the 18 millimeter lens. And honestly, like, everybody hates on the 18 millimeter lens, and I love it. I think it's beautiful. But even, it's plenty sharp. I can tell a difference when I zoom in at like 100% on a landscape shot when it's, when it's wide open against like the 23 millimeter f2. But come on, at some point we're just splitting hairs to justify our decisions, or to, uh, I don't know, vilify certain gear that we have. But I think that a lot of it really comes down to just how we view that gear. Dave D asks, what's your opinion of the autofocus on the X100F compared to the XE3? Dave D, or I don't suppose you're David Dean by any chance? Just out of curiosity, I was friends with a young man named David Dean at one point. he was a kid that I was a camp counselor for. I actually used to date his sister. And nope, okay. Well, he got into photography, and it was just a wild shot in the dark. Sorry, a little tangent there. Yeah, autofocus between the X100F and the XE3. On the XE3, some of the autofocus performance is going to vary according to the lens that you have. So one of the reasons why people do fairly bag on the 18 millimeter and the 27 millimeter, kind of the older, redheaded stepchildren of the Fuji lens family. No offense to anybody who's a stepchild or has red hair or both, just a figure of speech there. But some of these lenses are a little bit slower. The 18 millimeter, 27 millimeter, they're not super, super fast with their acquisition of autofocus. But if you put something like the 35 millimeter f2 or, one of the newer lenses basically on the XE3, it is, it is fast. It is really, really fast. Both in acquisition of autofocus, it's really fast, and also the ability to track moving subjects. And I haven't done a huge amount of customization of the tracking autofocus to really adjust it to certain types of moving subjects. I've just kind of played with it out of the box, and because I don't really shoot a lot of really high speed stuff. Most of the high speed photography that I shoot is my daughter, and fairly erratic movements. She's running around and stuff, and the XE3 really surprised me, because I felt like when I first got the XT2, and I understand that they have done some improvements to the XT2 to improve the autofocus and update the algorithm there. And so now my understanding is that the XT2 with the firmware update, the most recent firmware update, is at the same level of performance as the XE3. But up until that most recent firmware update, the XE3 was actually faster than the XT2, and I would say, faster, decidedly faster than the X100F. So, yeah, it's definitely faster, and I felt like if you kind of compare the X100T, or if you have a continuum in terms of the continuum in terms of the autofocus performance. Everybody, the X100 series always had kind of slow autofocus, and my thought in getting the 100F is that it was going to be further away from the X100T, and it was going to be performing closer to the XT2, like closer to their higher end interchangeable lens systems, rather than just a slightly faster version of the X100T. And it turns out it was really actually closer to an X100T in the speed of the autofocus, what it felt like to me. And the XE3, I would say, I would describe the autofocus with the 23 millimeter lens on it as very snappy. It's just, I don't know how to put it in, quantify it in scientific terms, because I am not an engineer, but I can tell you that there was no hunting, there was nothing. It was just like bang, 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 push button, picture. It's like just boom, like that. Low light, whatever. Whereas with the X100F, there's a little bit more hunting. There's a little bit slower to get in there. Yeah, that's what I think about. And that said, I want to say that the X100F is not bad. The autofocus on the X100F is not bad. It's just that the XE3 is better. So it depends on really what you need out of the camera. And I am not typically in situations where I require autofocus that is as fast as the XE3. That difference in autofocus wouldn't be a deal breaker for me. But when you have a camera that is this relatively inexpensive, you know, I'm pretty happy to have better performance in a smaller camera that's cheaper. That doesn't suck to get that much more for less money. In terms of being good enough to capture fast moving kids in not great light, the autofocus, the continuous autofocus shooting that I've done has been mostly in fairly decent light. And I think that if you put any autofocus system in not great light and you have fast moving erratic subjects in not great light, you're going to have to do something to control one of those variables to really have good control over the quality of the images that are going to come out of there. I think that I think that you can still probably do, and again, what you call not great light, that varies. But I think that in other words, your rate of keepers is probably not going to be like 90% in not great light. But by the sound of it, you've already kind of either bought the X100F and you want to know whether you're going to be sorry that you bought it, or you're thinking that you're kind of settled on it, maybe haven't actually pulled the trigger on it yet. If the one thing that you're going to buy is, or if the one thing that you're going to be predominantly shooting is like your kids, and for like a family camera, for mostly family photography, I would say, yeah, it's going to be great. It's going to be fantastic. Um, and if you're happy with the X70 and you enjoy that, then the X100F is going to be at least as good and probably better. Because the autofocus in the 100F was definitely improved over the T, but it's not quite on par with the XE3. So I guess that would be my only thing. Again, it's kind of splitting hair. So I don't think that you would hate the X100F by any stretch of the imagination. It's a fantastic camera. It's just that you're going to have to work a little bit harder and maybe get fewer keepers when you're using the X100F in lower light with moving subjects, and so that's going to be something where you got to work around that. But I think to a certain extent that could be said of just about any camera and lens combination when you're putting it in circumstances where it's not going to perform best, that you're going to have to try to make the best out of it that you can. Let's see, got a couple more questions. Gavin Fernandez asked if the XE3 is a cheaper build quality than the X100T. In a lot of ways, I feel like the XE3 reminds me a lot of the X100T in terms of the build quality. And in some ways, I think it feels even a slightly more sturdy, maybe because it doesn't have as many buttons on it. And a lot more of it is, and buttons can kind of feel a little bit flimsy, like they kind of, depending on how much play there is in a button, like when you kind of run your fingers over it and you feel the button wobble, it feels kind of cheap. And then you start thinking about it and you're like, oh man, this is light and plasticky. Build quality, again, it's a very relative thing, but when I was prepared for this to be lighter and more plasticky, especially once you put the lens on there. It's a nice balance because it feels solid, but it does feel quite light at the same time. So again, what some people might call light and plasticky, it doesn't feel quite like the XT2. Like the XT2 is beefy and felt really solid. This feels solid, but definitely on the lighter side. And it's a fun camera. I don't know how else to explain it other than to say that it feels really well built, though. It's not like, because build quality, a lot of people conflate weight with build quality, and that something needs to be heavy and solid and feel like a brick when you put it down, and when you're picking it up, and like in order for it to be good build quality. This is very light, but I feel like the build quality on it also feels very solid. And the ergonomics of the camera are really fantastic too, because when there's enough of a grip here, especially when you put the thumb catch on it, when you put the thumb catch on it, you can kind of see there's a decent little, the little hand grip here is really nice. And I've had like the almost fell off my exercise ball here, the 16 millimeter f1.4, which is one of the larger lenses for the system. Put that on here, and with the thumb grip, it handles really well. I have no issue with it at all. It handles differently than like the 18, which is super light lens. But when you put a heavier lens on there, it's not uncomfortable or insecure feeling. And I feel like the build quality is good, but it is different because it's lighter than the XT2. And in a lot of ways, there's different things to like about both. If you have the XT2, and when I did have the XT2, I loved the build quality. I loved how solid it felt. But on the other hand, like having a lighter camera that feels like it's equally well built, albeit lighter, I don't hate that. I don't hate having a lighter camera. I mean, it feels fantastic. Martin Corona says, oh, I'm sorry, Peter Ken asked if there's any low light autofocus issues with the XE3, especially with the 18 millimeter. Sony's can't find focus in low light at all. Panasonic's do, but take forever. I have not experienced, there have not been any situations in which I've been um, really disappointed with the autofocus where I felt like it was just really bad. I think there's a certain natural amount of struggling in low light with the autofocus. I think the issue that I found with the autofocus in low light is less about the amount of light, and it still comes back to the contrast. So if there's a decent amount of contrast, I've felt like it's, reliable. Maybe not 100% of the time, but odds are in my favor when I'm taking photos that I'm going to be able to get it to, focus on what I want the right way, the right time, and also the fact that you can control your touch focus, your focus points here just by tapping on the screen as you're shooting. That gives you the ability to correct what the camera might not be getting. Um, well, I guess that's a different question if you're depending on what autofocus mode you're shooting in. Like, I usually use, that's why I use single point with this, and using single point with the touchscreen even in low light gives you a lot more control rather than letting it do like face tracking or other things where, if you let the camera think on its own, it might not always pick everything up in lower light. But if you just, do single point autofocus face tracking off and then you just move it around, I feel like you can get really superb results even in low light. The biggest thing though that has to do with the low light performance for this, I mean, it's at least as good, if not better, than any of the other Fuji cameras. So I guess for what that's worth, and I have never felt like the Fuji cameras were bad. Um, in terms of their low light, autofocus performance. Although the XT2, when I first got the XT2, I did feel like it hunted a little bit in the low light, and that is something that the XE3 has really impressed me with, is that it has not hunted almost at all with any lenses that I've put on it. It's done a really good job. The rare instances and where it will be a little bit uncertain, though, it almost always has to do more with the contrast between the subject and the background, and the camera being able to tell that this is a thing that is separate from the other thing, and therefore that it needs to focus on it, more so than the amount of available light. That's been my experience, and then just kind of managing the autofocus, single point face tracking off. I think that is something also that's really useful in lower light, and it gives really outstanding results. Um, Martin Corona says the XT2 does well with kids in low light, with the 16 millimeter 1.4. The XT2 does good, and that is what I've heard, and that makes sense to me. That it should be about, it's now up to speed or using the same stuff that is uh, that is inside the XE3. Peter Kent says that's good. Saw a demonstration of the XT20 doing great job in low light, and I would say whatever the XT20 can do, the XE3 will do as good, if not maybe a little bit better. I'm not super familiar with the XT20 in terms of the guts and the way it works, but I know it's all pretty much the same. As the firmware updates come out, they're all pretty much should be on an even keel as far as that autofocus goes. And again, the touchscreen combined with the autofocus are just really, really good. No, Dave, I have not shot with the XT20. I've shot with the XT10. I've shot with the XT2, and I've shot with the XE3, and more or less it comes down to whether you want more from the touch screen, touch capabilities, and fewer buttons, cleaner layout, versus the articulating flip screen. That's really what it comes down to from my understanding of the two cameras. Um, Otherwise, they're really comparable. To me, I think that the touch screen and the way they've implemented it with the swipe gestures and the removal of the buttons was something I was really skeptical about at first, but it's grown on me, and I absolutely love the simplicity of the XE3. I don't miss the flip screen personally. I think a lot of people get used to having it, and then once they have it, they can't live without it, and I get that. That's not a bad thing to want or to expect in a camera. But for my money, the advantages of the way they've implemented the touch technology in this, in the XE3, I like it. I like it better, I think, than the XT2, which is as close as I've gotten to the XT20, which is a very similar camera in a lot of ways. It's sort of a slightly pared down version of the XT2. And the other thing too is that the XE3 is absolutely on par in terms of performance with the XT20, and the XT2 with its latest firmware updates. So really everything comes down to just those technical features and the handling and what you really want. And I think a lot of it is that we get used to the features that our cameras have, and then we feel like we have to have them. Whereas, I never felt like I was missing out on having touch technology in the cameras until I started shooting Panasonic for video. And then once I started doing that, I was like, man, this is, what's up, Fuji? How come you don't have that? And even then with stills, it was like, do I really want to use the touchscreen stuff for stills? That's a little weird. That feels like mixing two foreign things that shouldn't be, overlapping. And then I tried the XE3, and now I'm like, yeah, I don't know if I would want to have a camera. It made it easier for me to relinquish the X100F and to sell that because it didn't have the touchscreen on it, whereas on the XE3 it grew on me, and so now I'm like, yeah, I really like that. So there's a handful of smaller features that you may or may not want or need, and that's really what it boils down to, more so than the exact performance. The performance is going to be really good on all those cameras, low light, higher ISO, autofocus, all those things is going to be very comparable, if not identical in many situations. So a lot of it is just about style, aesthetics, and the external features that determine how the camera handles and how you like to shoot. And again, some people really, their world revolves around having that articulating screen. For me, it doesn't. So I haven't missed having that articulating screen. But if I could have this camera the same, but just with the ability to move the screen around, yeah, I would take the ability. It's a good option to have. But that's kind of what it comes down to in my mind. Going back a couple here, Mohammed asks, how do I find the XE3 EVF while shooting on a sunny day? So this is my main complaint, and I do have kind of a review of the XE3 that I'm gonna edit, that I've been saying I'm gonna edit for like a month, and I have been kind of working on it and going back and forth. But the big beef that I have with the XE3 is that the EVF is just, irritatingly subpar. The EVF, actually, I shouldn't say it's the EVF itself. Really, the EVF is fine. It's the eyepiece and the fact that it is not very, it's not very deep. And so, and I'll get as close as I can here, hopefully that you can see, but the eyepiece is not very deep. And because of the fact that the eyepiece is not recessed, when you put it up to your eye and you try to shoot through it, especially on a sunny day, and that's specifically, I believe, what you're asking here, Mohammed, it can be really challenging. Again, it's not a deal breaker for me, but it's one of those things where it's just like, oh my goodness, Fuji, like, you have such a good camera. Like, this is an $800, $900 camera that is like, can go punch for punch against the XT2 in most circumstances in a lot of different ways. And you just had to do something that arbitrary, is just not put on a little piece of plastic that would have made it like awesome. So what I found is that when I'm shooting with the EVF on a sunny day, I just kind of, shade my hand over it when I put it up to my eye. And it's a little bit obnoxious. It's a little bit annoying, but most of the time I don't have, it's fine. But yeah, on a sunny day, this EVF, it's obnoxious, it's obnoxious, but it's like every camera, there's always going to be something that you wish that it was different, but that you can still live with. It's not a deal breaker, but it is definitely it is something that could be better. Let's put it that way. So yeah, I have used it on sunny days, and again, it depends on how exactly you're positioned in relationship to the light. But I haven't encountered any situations where it's something that I couldn't resolve just by putting my hand up next to the camera and just, using that to block out a little bit of the ambient light and to provide a little shade for myself. So annoying, but I got over it. Yes. Okay. Oh, you're very welcome, Mohammed. Happy to be able to help. Just reading here. Tim helps. Says I've done a bit of high speed flash sync with the X100T, like the results, and is asking if that same sort of high speed sync can be done using the electronic shutter on the XE3. Honestly, I have not done any flash photography on any of the Fuji cameras. I don't shoot flash. It's somewhere between that just not being my style, because mostly the context that shaped my photography was more documentary adventure stuff, being out in the woods, backpacks, climbing big walls, etc., and not bringing flashes. It's like, hey, hold your headlamp on this, dude, or I'm gonna hang my headlamp off of the top of the portal edge, and then kind of hang off the rope and take a picture, and you make do with what you have. That's what I've done for situations that require more light. Not saying that that is better or in any way more admirable. Some of it is probably at this point just slothfulness on my point, because I have chosen not to invest in flashes, but that's a step that may be forthcoming in my photographic career. All that to say, I'm not the guy to ask about flashes. I have not used them very much, but I think Peter hit the nail on the head there with the leaf shutter on the X100 series being a specific advantage with shooting high-speed sync flashes there on the X100 series versus the XE3. I believe that the XE3 does not have that leaf shutter on it, and so it's going to be at a little bit of a disadvantage there. How much of a disadvantage exactly, I could not personally tell you. So I'm sorry. I do not know that right off the top of my head. But yeah, something that I have, I always feel a little bit guilty, when people ask me questions about flashes, because it's like, if I was a real photographer, blah, blah, blah. I shoot the way that I shoot, and it's funny because as photographers of any variety, I feel like, excuse me one moment, I'm being paged by my daughter. Yes, Leela, what can I do for you?
Could you wipe my...
Excuse me?
Could you wipe my butt?
Oh man, this is interesting. Excuse me for a moment. My daughter has just gone to the bathroom, and I will have to help her. I will be right back. Nice work, Leela. No, you made the right call. You made the right call. Where?
Why don't you wipe me with wipes?
Wipes? Okay, here. Oh boy, let's see. All right, sorry about that, gang. Um, that's most everybody stayed here. I feel honored and loved. Thank you. Yeah, my daughter just she peeked around the corner. She's like, "Dad, can you wipe my butt?" I'm like, well, what do you say to that? Not like I'm really gonna say no. Um, oh, the joys of parenthood. Anyhow, yeah, the X100T, super awesome camera. In a lot of ways, if I had to do over again, I probably would have stuck with the T and not gotten the F, just because of the fact that they're both the T is so good, and the F is also very good, but like the advantage for the money, it's hard to say that it's worth that extra. Okay. Peter says that the X100T can sync with a flash up to 1/2000th of a second, while the XE3 is limited to 1/180th of a second. So that's kind of a big. I mean, I'm not a huge, like I said, I'm not a flash guy, but that's a pretty big difference in terms of like the amount of flexibility that you have for your shutter speed when using a flash. So yeah, that sounds like a big advantage if you want to do flash photography, the X100 series there. Amber asks if I have any thoughts on the X Pro 2 versus the XE3. So to be clear, first of all, I have never shot the X Pro 2, only the X Pro 1, but I have owned and shot a lot with the XT2, which is kind of a similar, it's a similar grade of camera. It's a professional grade, quote unquote. I mean, for whatever that's worth. It's a camera with a little bit more meat on the bone, so to speak. And some of you guys in here may have some experience with the X Pro 2. You can feel free to chime in and share with Amber what you guys think. But in terms of the X Pro or XT2 versus the XE3, if you are just starting out, I would say that you would be much better served with the XE3. So again, that's just my opinion. I feel like a lot of times when people are starting out, they really want to start out. They're like, they get into something and they tend to overbuy. I do this. We all do this. Everybody goes in, they get gung ho. They don't want to learn the landscape. Not that they don't want to learn the landscape. I mean, it's that the appearance is oftentimes that the more you spend, the more you get. And that is true. But at the same time, when you're starting off with a camera, you don't necessarily need a lot of the features that you get and a lot of the high-end capabilities that you get with the camera, which really translates more to at least comparing the XT2, because again, I haven't shot with the X Pro 2, but you get weather sealing, you get dual UHS 2 card slots, you get a better 4K because it crops a little bit on the sensor, and so it changes the way that it reads. It gives you a little bit sharper 4K if you're shooting video. The controls are a little bit different, etc. So, and I imagine that some of those same features, with the exception of the 4K, I believe the X Pro 2 has the dual UHS 2 card slots. I think it also has the weather sealing on it. A handful of features that if you're using a camera a lot and you're shooting, 100 days out of the year in a context where you need to have redundancy built into the camera, you need the camera to be a little more burly, then yeah, it's worth it to spend a couple $100 extra and have that camera go the distance. Where the XE3, it's not a cheaply built camera, but it's not a workhorse camera. Like, it's a camera that really, when you pick it up, it feels fun. The build quality says this is a fun camera. Let's go out and play. Not like 150, 200 days out of the year. Let's go out shooting and just get thrown around and abused. That's not so much what this camera, I feel like, is meant for, the XE3. In terms of strictly performance, when you're talking about image quality, ISO, low noise performance, autofocus ability, and just general image quality, there's really, in my mind, I can't see too many reasons why one would need to buy the X Pro 2 or the XT2 over the XE3. That's one of the reasons why I was so impressed with the XE3, is the image quality, autofocus speed, ISO performance, all of that stuff is so fantastic. And and I guess they fixed this with the update, the latest firmware update too, but the XE3 can shoot like up to, I believe, 15-minute exposures in camera. And and I don't know where the X Pro 2 stands on that, but there's a lot of meat on the bone with this camera. It's just not necessarily built for the same amount of abuse that the X Pro or the XT2 series are. So again, Amber, I don't know exactly where you are in your photography, if you're just starting out or if you've been doing this for a while. My guess or my assumption is that if you're asking a question like this to me on a chat, that you're probably not so experienced or so far along that you already know the answer to that question. I'm not trying to be smug. I'm just being, trying to use a little intuition here. And so most of the time when people are starting out and they ask a question like that, I feel like the right answer is almost always less is more. Whatever is going to give you more economy and going to allow you to maybe buy an extra lens, or maybe take, a weekend off and go somewhere that's really inspiring to you and shoot something, rather than trying to buy more camera that you're not really going to benefit from having that extra, those extra features or what have you. And in terms of just strictly performance, as I laid out, the XE3 is, absolutely on par with those cameras. It's just maybe the durability, the build quality, and like the redundancy, which are something that, yeah, if you're shooting a whole bunch, that could come in handy. Yeah, the X100 series is outstanding. You know, I think especially if you're just starting out, the X100 series it limits you in a good way, and it forces you to learn. And then as you learn, then you get more curious and say, oh well, what would this have looked like if I had used this lens, or how does this change that? And you start to kind of get familiar to the point where then it's worth your money to go out and spend on a new camera because you know what it is that you're buying for. You know what it is that you need to get out of it. Most of the time, if your thought process is like, well, if I spend this much more, and you don't know exactly what it is that you're spending the more for, then the answer is don't spend more, because you don't know what you're, you know, like if it was something that you needed that much, you would be able to recognize it and say, well, this is why I'm buying this. And there's no mistaking the fact that in most cases, you can't really, even doing a comparison of all these different cameras, like at the end of the day, they all kind of are very, very similar. So when in doubt, why buy a more expensive camera when you could just buy a cheaper one that does kind of the same thing? Hey, Yusuf, good to see you here this evening. The other thing too that what was I going to say? Oh, it slipped my mind. I was going to say something else about this, but I'll get to that. Peter Kent says, I'm going to wait for the XH1 announcement this month, just in case it can replace the GH5, but the rumors don't sound that much better than the XT2, so I think the XE3 will still be good enough for me. Peter, I hope you buy the XE3 because of the fact that you are to blame for the fact that I bought the XE3, although I thank you for that because I'm glad that I did. I do not regret that at all. But yeah, from everything that I've read so far about the XH1, yeah, I don't think that it's going to supplant the GH5 in terms of video work. I just don't see that happening at this point. Just because of the fact that Panasonic has been making this type of camera and has been maturing it along and through so many different iterations, and Fuji is not one to try to, you know, bite that whole apple off in one shot. They're going to take multiple iterations of that camera to get it refined to the point where it could potentially compete with the GH5. And I think we've already seen some of that with, you know, them including 4K in a couple of the cameras that they have and stuff like that. But okay, well, as long as you keep the XE3 in the mix somewhere, you know, that'll be good. Oh, King Yuzi, good to see you here. I'm glad that you're able to make it. You know, when King Yuzi or Yusuf, you said to me one time that your weekend does not feel complete without this live stream, and that is one of the most. I'm being completely honest here. I'm not just buttering you up. That is one of the kindest and the most. I think about that. Like when people say things like that to me, it is the difference between my saying, I don't know if I want to go on versus saying, you know what, like I'm gonna get there. I'm gonna show up because, you know, I know that you guys care, and that it means something. You know, and that means a lot to me. So I'm glad that you stopped by, especially with the Lord of the Rings marathon tomorrow, which is like not a small event, and that also with your birthday. Yes, happy birthday to you. That's a hell of a way to celebrate your birthday. Very, very cool. I'm moderately jealous. We got hammered with snow here over the weekend here in the Northeast. So, or not weekend, it's, well, I've been off school for a while, so everything feels like the weekend to me. Spent the last couple days shoveling snow, building igloos with my daughter, and tomorrow we're probably going to go out and like build a snow fort because there's like 15, 16 foot high snow drifts and snow embankments that have been piled up, so we're going to dig those out. And I'm not sure how much photography I'm going to be doing out there because honestly, it's just fun to play sometimes and not have to mess around with the cameras. Oh well, this is very real news. Snow in the snow department at super nice. Yeah, the California folks, everybody is. You know, every winter there's just like phenomena that happens where everybody that I know who it who's out west somewhere, they start posting these pictures of themselves out by the swimming pool and like, oh man, the temperature is so bad. And it's just like, you know what? You know, I'm not going to make any disparaging comments about fires, but you know, that stuff comes to mind a little bit, especially when, you know, people make the comparisons and saying like, you know, who's worse off. Honestly, you know, I mean, nobody wants to have to deal with any kind of, you know, act of God like that. But if I had to choose between one or the other, It's a tough call, honestly, but I think it's easier. There are some cases, at least, which I can say I would enjoy. I do enjoy the snow, even though it's hard work, backbreaking, literally work, and very cold and hard. But it affords me a really good opportunity to go out and play in the snow with my daughter, which was a big part of my life growing up. And there's something very empowering about being able to go outside and get after it in the snow, even when it's very hostile conditions, and still stay warm and be able to like look after yourself. It's really cool. But have a good evening, Yusuf. Enjoy the Lord of the Rings marathon. Happy birthday. Take care of yourself, and thank you so much for being part of this. What we do here with the photography community, and we'll see you soon. I hope on one of these future videos coming up. Jason asked, how many shots do I usually get out of a charge on the XE3? That is a good question. I don't know exactly, because like what I do is I usually kind of I don't always use my batteries all the way through until they're completely tanked. What I'll do is I'll just kind of swap batteries out. Like if I have half a battery left and I'm going to go out shooting, I'll just put in a new battery right from the outset, because in most situations I don't need a second battery. If I have one fresh battery, that'll take me the duration of just about anything that I'm going to be shooting. The way that I've been shooting recently, and that is kind of sporadically and without a whole lot of intensity or discipline. See end of years kind of lack of motivation and starting off a new year and kind of lagging and dragging a little bit is what I've been doing in some areas, because I went from being super highly structured, disciplined with like school and like visiting family and all these different things, and then now I'm kind of in a situation where I'm just doing school's out, Christmas break, all this stuff, and it's just been like a little bit too much opportunity to relax and just be lazy. And so I've been taking full advantage of that, but I'm going to have to get back on the horse here and shoot a little bit more diligently and edit more diligently too here in the near future, and do a better job of following through on my on my promises of the the weekly uploads and all that stuff. But to answer your question, the battery life is really good compared to the other Fuji cameras, I would say. I think that a lot of it has to do with, how much you're using the EVF and how much you're going back and forth there, and not having the option for the optical viewfinder is kind of a bummer in that way, because with the X100F, you could conserve some battery life by using the optical viewfinder instead of the electronic viewfinder, which eats battery. But I have found this to be, the battery life has been something that I've been very impressed with. Much more so than what I anticipated, but I honestly don't know exactly how many shots I get out of one battery. That's really hard to say, because what I do is like I'll shoot like half battery, and then I take those images off and I dump those out, and then I'll put in a new card, or maybe even if I keep the same battery, I'll put in a new card, and then I forget kind of where I'm at. But I can tell you is, for frame of reference, that I may have mentioned this on a few videos or a few live streams already, and I have a video that I'm in the process of putting together about this. When I shot at night with the XE3, I took it out in 20-degree weather and shot for an hour and a half to 2 hours, and doing 30-second to 60-second exposures, plus focus checking, plus image checking and pixel peeping and all that stuff in 20-degree weather for hour and a half, hour 45 minutes, let's just call it. And it ate 25% of the battery. So it held up really well under some very austere conditions, shooting, I don't know, maybe 60 or 70 long exposure images in really demanding circumstances. How that translates, yeah, it's much better than what I was expecting, honestly. I was really like prepared for it to be, a problem, and it was really, really good. So I would say that the battery life, while I can't exactly nail it down, I would say the battery life is substantial, very good. It's really, really very good. Amber says, I mentioned the X100T over the F for beginner. Any major differences other than the price? Um, the X100F has a couple of features that are the layout externally is a little bit different. It has so the X100F has 24 megapixel file, so it gives you a little bit bigger if you want to print bigger and crop a little bit more. So there's a little bit more flexibility there. At the end of the day, though, 16 megapixel file, I've printed 20 by 30 off of those, and they could go bigger still. So there is, you get a little bit more real estate with the X100F 24 megapixel file, which is nice. You also get the Acros film simulation in there if you want to shoot JPEG. So that's a nice thing to have. It also has, externally speaking, the layout is a little bit different. It has the ISO with a separate component built into the shutter speed wheel so that you can access the ISO differently, and it has the joystick on there as well instead of the you can move your focus points a little bit differently, but you have to activate it through, basically use the D-pad to, the directional pad on the X100T to move your focus points on there. But for the most part, it's a couple fairly small tweaks. The autofocus is a tiny bit faster. The files are a little bit bigger, and it has the film simulation and a couple of layout things that are different. But for, again, it depends on the price, but I'm going to assume somewhere in the neighborhood of a $500 price difference between the two cameras. To me, if you're just starting out, you wouldn't get $500 worth of better images or better performance on the F than you would with a X100T that's in good shape that you get off of eBay. I don't think that you would. So that's just my 2 cents about that. Mohammed says, I am really onto the XE3 for many reasons. Joystick, 15-minute shutter speed in camera, rangefinder style, histogram in the EVF with highlights and blinkies. The only things that annoys me is the eye cup. Yeah, the eye cup is definitely annoying. I have heard that you can get, and I feel the same way about the XE3. I love it, and to me, the thing that frustrates me the most about the EVF on the XE3 is that by comparison, the rest of the camera is so flippin' awesome and it performs so well. It punches above its weight in so many ways that to have one little thing handicapped like the eye cup, which is just a piece of plastic that they cannot fix with a firmware update, it seems outrageous. Now, I believe that you can get an aftermarket or off-brand eye cup to fix that problem, relatively speaking. To me, I haven't looked into that yet. I haven't done that. It may be possible, but it probably will not look great, and it will change the aesthetic of the camera and be a little bit clunky, as most, off-brand products are. So I'm probably not going to go that route, and I am going to just continue to complain about it a little bit because, for some people that's going to make a bigger difference, and I think that, it's something to be aware of. But other than that, the XE3 really is phenomenal. I agree 100%. Tim is thinking of going with a 2-lens kit for the XE3 rather than the usual 3. What other prime would I go with apart from the 35, considering the 14, but is it too wide from the 35? That's tricky. I would say if you already have the 35, do you already have the 35, or are you just kind of fixed on the idea of the 35? Because if I had to pick two, and a lot of it has to do with and when you say 35, do you mean 35 or the 23, 35 millimeter equivalent? Because the 35 millimeter lens, which is a 50 millimeter equivalent, is awesome. And to me, the 23 and the 55 are a really, really beautiful combination. I would, okay. Yeah, if you already have the 35 f2, that's a really fantastic lens for doing a lot. I mean, because it's just tele enough that you can do some really nice portraits. You can do some, longer distance landscape stuff like mountains or whatever in the distance, and you get the compression. that with kind of the slightly telephoto lens that gives you. Um, I might get skewered for saying this, but I like the 18 millimeter f2. It's a pretty darn nice lens if you get a good copy of it. I know some people have gotten bad copies of it; they're not super happy with it. The other thing too is that the 16 or the 23. The 16 or the 23 millimeter lens are both really good wider lenses. The question is, how wide is too wide? How do you like to shoot? I think one thing that is nice. Okay, so I can't give you that. That's a lousy answer. I can't just say, oh, we'll get one of these other, because you asked me for two lenses. I would say get the 16, because the 16 is different enough from the 35 where it's going to force you to shoot in a decidedly different way, and it's going to add a different dramatic element to what you're shooting. The 16 will versus the 23. So it's not the cheapest lens, but it is a very, very good lens. It is reasonably fast. It is incredibly sharp. And when I say fast, I mean fast in terms of autofocus and the 1.4 aperture. It is a really, really outstanding lens. It is the one lens, like to me, the 24 millimeter lens. If I was, or 24 millimeter equivalent, I should say, if there was one lens that I had to pick for my Fuji system, that would be the lens, because I can always get closer, even if there's distortion, facial distortion notwithstanding. You can do just about anything with a 24 millimeter lens, and that's kind of what I cut my teeth, or I'm sorry, 16 millimeter, 24 millimeter equivalent. That's what I cut my teeth shooting, was all like climbing, adventure, landscape, and just pretty much environmental portraiture that I cut my teeth shooting. That 24 millimeter equivalent. And the 16 millimeter lens from Fuji is exquisite, especially for the price. It's weather sealed and all that good stuff too. So I would say, uh, you know, there is that. Now, on the other hand, just to give a slight devil's advocate, the 18 millimeter f2 could also be a really good consideration, because it is quite wide, but it's not quite as obviously quite as wide. It's like 2 millimeter focal length difference, but it's still quite wide, but it is much lighter. And so the thing is, if the handling and the lightness and the agility is a big feature to you, that you're like a stickler for that type of thing, and the way that you like to shoot, I would say get the 18 millimeter over the 16. And I know that somewhere there are people going to be cursing my forebears for making comparison between these two lenses, because everybody says that the 18 is so inferior to the 16, and like the 16 is a brilliant lens, it is amazing, but at the same time, the 18 is very, very, very light, and it is very capable. It is I believe it is a good lens. It may not be, if you're pixel peeping, you can find flaws in just about anything, but the 18 is also, I think, a very worthy consideration, because of the way how well it matched. That's been the lens that I've been walking around with on the XE3 for the last couple of weeks since I got it. Super light, very easy to handle, and it gets you almost as wide and almost as fast. And the image quality, unless you put it under a microscope, nobody's ever going to know the difference. That's my belief, and there are some people that find fault because of that, but I would say, to keep the handling equivalent, like the camera handles one way with the 35 millimeter f2, which is a very small lens. I need to get that lens. I used to have it, and then I sold it, and I got to buy it again. But whatever, I miss that lens. That lens is so good. And it's going to handle very differently from that 35 millimeter f2. If you put a 16 millimeter on there, it's going to feel very different, and it's going to be like, whoa, what just happened? And there's always going to be that little, like, compensation that's going to happen, because you're using a lens that's like 4 times as heavy and just bigger, and not the end of the world. And if you really want that 24 millimeter perspective versus the 27 millimeter perspective that you get on this, you know it's worth it. It's a very, very good lens. I have it, keeping it. That's my story. I'm sticking to it. But if I wanted to have the same handling and have it feel very equivalent, the 18 millimeter is going to feel like shooting the 35 in terms of the feeling and the handling and the carrying and all of that stuff. So just something to think about. and I'm going to do a video here in the future about kind of these underrated, the 27 and the 18 millimeter lenses, which I think are the most underrated lenses in the Fuji system, and kind of, you know, encourage people to take a second look at them, because I think they have a lot to offer, both for their value with, their price that they go for, and also just the fact that they're so small and light, and that is hugely advantageous, because so many people buy into Fuji because they want something that is light. But you put on like the 56 millimeter f1.2, beautiful lens, absolutely love it. Shot it for a while but got rid of it because I don't really shoot that way most of the time. Same thing with the 16, beautiful lens, love it. But, again, not a small lens. And so you kind of defeat some of the purpose. Again, it's relative depending on where you're coming from, but what system you're coming from. But, you get a tiny little camera and then you put a pretty big chunky lens on there, then you kind of defeat some of the purpose, and it's a little bit less, it's a little bit of a downer. Whereas if you just put a small, keep the lenses small, then, you're better off in some ways. And I think these small lenses, these light lenses, are worth considering. Okay, let's see here. Peter says the new 82.8 macro is supposed to be great too. Yes, as well as the 50 millimeter f2, the new 50 millimeter portrait lens is also supposed to be really small and beautiful as well. I would love to see them do like a 16 millimeter, like redo the 16 millimeter in an f2 version that was, smaller and lighter as well. I think, and that's one of the things that I'm hoping they're going to continue doing, is continuing to make smaller, more travel economical versions of some of their bigger lenses as they go. Michael says, my friend, it sounds like the perfect travel camera. Fuji film simulations, bar none, hands down the best choice. Color science and mirrorless. Thank you. Agreed, Michael. The lenses absolutely are epic. I love the lenses. I love the color science on this. And for a travel camera, I think that the only thing I would say that's lacking on this that would be really, really nice would be weather sealing. If they would put weather sealing on this, it would just make my day. I mean, I can live without it, but I would rather not. But if I had to say from a travel camera perspective, I would probably say XT2 over the XE3, just because of the fact that the weather sealing. I mean, at the same time, I know Angry Ken, like he's always talking about how weather sealing is such a gimmick and blah blah blah, and it's all like, what was it, the slower, longer term. I forget the word he uses. It's right on the tip of my tongue. But like there's difference between, the cameras don't get ruined from being like rained on. It's more like the insidious long-term effects of weather and humidity over months or years. Pervasive, yes. Pervasive versus invasive, yes. Thank you, Thomas. I appreciate that. Good to see you here this evening. Yes, pervasive versus invasive, I think, is the way he says it. Yeah, I agree with that. But at the same time, when you're traveling, it gives you a little extra feeling of security, especially. And I think for a lot of people, I think that holds true. I know if you're doing like real adventure traveling and stuff like that, and you're outside a lot, you may actually benefit from, you could actually experience invasive weather damage in addition to the pervasive over time weather damage. So I think that Ken is right on for a lot of people's situations or use cases. But I think for other people, if you're really getting after it and you're in the outdoors a lot and there's a lot of dust and all that stuff, yeah, the weather sealing could still be beneficial. And a camera this small with this good performance, it seems like, kind of a no-brainer. But they had to do something to handicap it. So then, there's also the XT1. That's the reason why I'm a big fan of the XT1. And I would even steer a lot of people towards that, because it's still a darn good camera for not a whole lot of money, and it's weather sealed. And so you have, that if you really have to have the weather sealing at a reasonable price point. Yeah, a new 18.2, a 16.2, Peter, would actually be what I would like to see. Mohammed asks if I have tried the Samyang 12mm f2 for landscape along with the XE3. Do I think it is sharp? I have not used that with the XE3. or the X-T2. I haven't used any Samyang lenses on the Fujis, although I have heard that they have less, I believe, less chroma distortion, which is like it's useful if you're shooting like stars, Milky Way shots, and stuff like that. Um, some people say it's better than the 16 for that purpose, but I haven't used it or seen it myself. My understanding is that they're very sharp. They're fantastic lenses, and if you're okay with um, manual focus, that they can be a really good way to go. And I think with the um, manual focus assist and the focus peaking and all that stuff that are in these cameras, I think that you know anybody could be and should be very comfortable with manual focus and should not be intimidated by the idea of using manual focus, even for shooting dynamic subjects. Because I found that you know, shooting a lot of vintage lenses, which is something that I really enjoy doing with the XE3. I have a couple Minolta lenses, some Takumar lenses. I made some videos about these, and I love shooting the vintage glass on these cameras, manual focus, all manual focus, and don't need the lenses talking to the camera to get really good shots and to feel really comfortable with it, because it's very easy to get a real good precise manual focus. And honestly, it's a little bit more fun to work a little bit differently and to be more involved with the process, and I enjoy that. So yeah, I think the Samyang is probably a really good bat, really sharp, but again, you got to be able to deal with manual focus. Thomas Love says a simple plastic bag with a lens that sticks out is one way to fight the rain and the dust. That is very true. And in some cases, my only argument, counterpoint, I guess, to that would be that, if you know that it's going to rain and you have time to get it set up, you can make that work. And I totally agree. I've done that. Uh, if you're in a situation where you're kind of running and gunning and you just need a camera that is like, for example, and I think about this in terms of what I do with climbing. If I have a camera that is not weather sealed and I'm in the middle of a climb, plastic bags just not going to enter into the equation, other than put my camera in it, put it in the pack, and we're done. Like, I'm just not, done in terms of taking pictures, because I can't be fiddling with a plastic bag and doing what I'm doing, because I have to be able to devote full focus to the climbing. If I can leave my camera exposed and just like point and shoot as I'm going without having to really devote any extra attention to managing the weather situation, worrying about the weathering of my camera, that's a big advantage for me. It's not a big advantage 100% of the time. It's a big advantage a very, very small percentage of the time, which is the reason why to me it's not a deal breaker. But and I think in most situations, a plastic bag is certainly a really good way to go about doing that. But for me, I need a camera that's always on and ready to go. I can't really mess around with that. But that's more my personal situation than a criticism of your specific point. Um, okay, let's see. Mohammed says he would really appreciate a separate video about vintage lenses along with the XE3. I do have a video about vintage lenses, but I will do a specific one about vintage lenses on the XE3 specifically. I will do one of those here in the next couple of weeks. I'm glad I'm not the only one that enjoys shooting the older glass on these cameras, because it's like they're so cheap and the quality is so good. Like the Minolta MD lenses are just amazing. They're so good, so good. And even some of the old Fujinon lenses, like I have a 135 f3.5 or something, old lens, beautiful tele lens though, and sharp as a tack. You get like a $15-20 adapter, you throw it on there, or even like a $75 speed booster if you want to go that route, and just does wonderful things, and it's easy to use. So pretty much what I usually do when I'm advising people on buying new setup, I say because most of the time when you're shooting tele stuff, unless you're doing portraits of little kids who aren't going to sit still for you, most of the time tele lenses, you're going to be better off getting vintage glass for your tele glass, because you're not going to be shooting the tele stuff in super low light, you know um, at least in most of the situations I've run across. If you're shooting in low light, it's probably going to be something a little bit wider, that's you're a little bit closer to, that you're interacting with, it's a little bit clearer. And spend the money if you need autofocus, spend that money on getting autofocus in a wider lens so you get one lens where you're paying full price for it, get like a 23 or 35 or what have you. And then, for tele lenses to fill in the tighter focal lengths, fill those in with vintage glass and use manual focus on those because the image quality is superb and you can get that reach that you need without having to worry about without worrying about spending a lot of extra money on getting the autofocus for it. Which, not to say the autofocus isn't nice to have, but like, having the 3 or 4 lenses that give you a wide variety of focal lengths for the price of like 1.5 lenses is really nice, and especially when you're starting out. And then you learn how to use manual focus, which I think probably is going to help make you a more deliberate and thoughtful photographer, which ultimately somewhere along the line translates into better quality images from being more deliberate and thoughtful, right? Suresh, I am sorry, I'm the wrong guy to talk to about flash units. Completely, I have nothing for you there, sir. Sorry. I don't shoot with flash and don't know anything about it. I would recommend looking up David Hobby, strobist.com. He shoots Fuji, or he did the last time I checked, and he has packages that, and could, if you look him up on Twitter, he's fairly responsive, and he could probably give you some good information about shooting flashes on the Fuji system. All right. Well, folks, it has been 90 minutes, and I am about ready to conclude this live stream and go and take some insulin and get myself situated for the evening. I appreciate you guys taking the time to watch this. If anybody has any other questions or comments that I have not been able to address in this video, make sure you drop them down below. I would love it if you guys subscribe to this channel and continue to be part of these live streams. I do them every Friday night, just about. If you are connected with me on Twitter or Instagram, I am at Living Vertical on both social media channels, and I always have my social media stuff linked down below so you guys can connect with me. But that's where I announce if I'm not going to be able to make it at my usual 8 or 8:30 on Friday, East Coast time, Eastern Standard Time. I come on and do these live streams for usually somewhere between 1 and 3.5 hours, depending on how long people are interested in asking questions and how bored I am. But so I enjoy doing these, and I would love to have you guys subscribed if you're not already connected with me one form or another. Love to hear your questions, and if there's any other topics or things, ideas that maybe this video is giving you some ideas for, some things that you'd like to see or hear more about, make sure to let me know. And I appreciate all the good questions and ideas I've gotten just so far tonight. And thank you, Michael. I appreciate that. I really appreciate that a lot. That's very kind of you to say. And hopefully, my blood sugar, with all the snow shoveling, will, knock on wood, will remain good. And yeah, thank you guys, Mohammed. Appreciate your good questions, Peter. Thank you for kind of pigeonholing me into and provoking my gear acquisition syndrome, making me get this camera. And I'm looking forward to bringing you guys more. One of the other things I will say really quickly in closing, as the semester, ironically, as I have more pressure and less free time, especially what translates to less free time with my family, it means more videos a lot of times, because when I have free time with my family, my instinct is not like, oh, let me go shoot a vlog. It's like, oh, I can just sit on the couch and watch Netflix with my wife, which is not something that I can do throughout the rest of the semester. So when I'm in school, I'm at my dad's 3 hours away from here, which is the reason why you see this background, because I'm in the closet here, and some of you watch my videos, you already know this, it's redundant. Usually one person asks me this on every live stream, so I'm just kind of putting it out there since nobody asked tonight. But so I kind of split my time between 2 different locations, and when I'm at my dad's, I have literally nothing else to do besides work. So I'm either doing schoolwork because I'm still studying for the nursing program, and that's going to be starting up in about a week. So as I kind of get back into that physical location with where my proper studio is or what have you, that enables me to crank out a lot more work and focus on that. And right now I'm just kind of, you get it, it's vacation time or whatever, hanging out with the family. So it's been a little harder for me to kind of focus on this stuff and photography. It's been more just about like enjoying the family and enjoying the time. But I hope that you guys are doing some of that too, because we got the rest of the year to put our nose to the grindstone and get after it, and to see where this journey takes us. Anyways, guys, that's it. That's it for me. And thank you, Tim. I appreciate that. I do try to be calm and thoughtful. And you enjoy your weekend. I hope you have a great one. And buy cryptocurrencies, people. I'm not going to get started on that, but if you guys ever want to get me off topic, as some of you may know, I love talking about cryptocurrencies because that's my new thing. Like, I don't know enough about it to start a proper YouTube channel and make that the focus, but I have kind of gone way down the rabbit hole with cryptocurrencies, and I'm taking a big risk just by talking about this now that somebody's going to say something interesting. Don't say anything interesting, because then you're going to get me off track, and I'm never going to get out of here. All right, guys, have a good weekend. Well, isn't what a little bit late, Jason? Not late for getting into cryptocurrencies. Now is just the right time, but it's late in the video for me to mention that. Yes, and I did that intentionally so that I wouldn't get sidetracked, because otherwise I knew that I would just never get out of here. So I kind of did that. I tricked myself. I'm playing a little trick on myself. All right, everybody have a good weekend. Thank you so much. Subscribe if you're not here already, and we will see you guys on the next episode of the Adventure Photo Show. Looking forward to it, guys. Have a good weekend, good new year, and drop comments. I always check comments. I always get back to people. 100% response rate, even people that are rude and don't deserve it, and you guys are all wonderful people. So thank you for being here, and look forward to hearing from you.